Hello again, 122. In this video, we're going to go over Japan between the wars and try to find out why democratic institutions did not take hold more effectively. And during the first 2 decades of the 20th century, Japan made remarkable progress toward the creation of an advanced society on the Western model. But it was an experiment in democracy, something they really did not have any historical precedent for. And the influence of the old ruling oligarchies, the general, had not been significantly challenged, and nor that of the ideological foundation of the Kokutai, or the supreme authority of the emperor and the uniqueness of Japanese society. Those two things are still there. And these fragile democratic institutions were able to survive through the 20s, often called the era of Taisho democracy, from the reign title of the emperor during that time. And during this period, the military budget was reduced and a suffrage bill enacted in 1925 that granted the vote to all Japanese males. Although women were still disenfranchised, many women were active in the labor movement and in campaigning for social reforms. But the era was also marked by growing social turmoil, and two opposing forces within the system were gearing up to challenge the prevailing wisdom. On the left, a Marxist labor movement began to take shape in the early 1920s, and on the right, ultra-nationalist groups called for a rejection of Western models of development and a more militant approach to realizing national objectives. And this cultural conflict between old and new, indigenous and foreign, was reflected in literature. Japanese self-confidence had been restored after the victories over China and Russia, and it launched an age of cultural creativity in the early 20th century. Fascination with Western literature gave birth to a striking new genre called the I novel. Defying traditional Japanese reticence, some authors reveled in self-exposure with confessions of their innermost thoughts, and others found release in the proletarian literature movement of the early 1920s. Inspired by Soviet literary examples, these authors wanted literature to serve socialist goals and improve the lives of the working class. Finally, some Japanese writers blended Western psychology with Japanese sensibility in exquisite novels reeking with nostalgia for the old Japan. One well-known example is Some Prefer Nettles, written in 1929 by Junichiro Tanizaki, and it delicately juxtaposed the positive aspects of both traditional and modern Japan. By the 1930s, however, military censorship increasingly inhibited free literary expression. They also have a Zaibatsu economy that developed. Japan also continued to make impressive progress in economic development. Spurred by rising domestic demand and continued government investment in the economy, the production of raw materials tripled between 1900 and 1930, and industrial production increased more than 12-fold. Much of the increase went into exports, and Western manufacturers began to complain about competition from the Japanese. And we'll see this again in the 1980s as well. As often happens, rapid industrialization was accompanied by some hardship and rising social tensions. In the Meiji model, various manufacturing processes were concentrated in a single enterprise, the Zaibatsu, or financial clique. Some of these firms were existing companies that had capital and the foresight to move into new areas. Others were formed by enterprising samurai who used their status and managerial experience to good account in the new environment. Whatever their origins, these firms, often with official encouragement, developed into large conglomerates that controlled major segments of the Japanese economy. By 1937, the four largest Zaibatsu, Mitsui, Mitsubishi, Sumitomo, and Yasuda, controlled 21% of the banking industry, 26% of mining, 35% of shipbuilding, 38% of commercial shipping, and more than 60% of the paper manufacturing and insurance businesses. This concentration of power and wealth in a few industrial combines created problems in Japanese society. In the first place, it resulted in the emergence of a dual economy. On the one hand, a modern industry characterized by up-to-date methods and massive government subsidies, and on the other, a traditional manufacturing sector characterized by conservative methods and small-scale production techniques. Concentration of wealth also led to growing economic inequalities. As we have seen, economic growth had been achieved at the expense of the peasants. We talked about that, many of whom fled to the cities to escape rural poverty. That labor surplus benefited the industrial sector, but the urban proletariat was still poorly paid and ill-housed. A rapid increase in population. The total population of the Japanese islands increased from an estimated 43 million in 1900 to 73 million in 1940, and that led to food shortages and rising unemployment. In the meantime, those left on the farm continued to suffer. As late as the beginning of World War II, an estimated 1/2 of all Japanese farmers were tenants. And this is a picture of the great Tokyo earthquake that's cut off at the top here. That happened in September of 1923. It was a massive earthquake that struck central Japanese island of Honshu, and it caused 130,000 deaths, and it virtually demolished the whole city. And although the quake was a national tragedy, it also came to symbolize the ingenuity of the Japanese people, who rapidly reconstructed the city in a new and more modern style. That unity of national purpose would be demonstrated again a quarter of a century later in Japan's swift recovery from the devastation of World War II. So they've rebuilt this place more than once. Shirihara diplomacy. It was a final problem for Japanese leaders in the post-Meiji or Meiji era, and it was the familiar dilemma of finding sources of raw materials in foreign markets for the nation's manufactured goods. Until World War I, Japan had dealt with the problem by seizing territories or using imperialism, such as Taiwan, Korea, and southern Manchuria, and transforming them into colonies or protectorates. That policy had begun to arouse concern and, in some cases, the hostility of the Western nations. China was also becoming apprehensive. As we have seen, Japanese demands for the Shandong province at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919 aroused massive protest in China. That was the former German sphere of influence, and Germany was stripped, as we saw, of their colonies after World War I. The United States was especially concerned about Japanese aggressiveness. Although the United States had been less active than some European states in pursuing colonies in the Pacific, it had a strong interest in keeping the area open for U.S. commercial activities. And in 1922, in Washington, D.C., the United States convened a major conference of nations with interests in the Pacific to discuss the problems of regional security. The Washington Conference led to agreements on several issues, such as tonnage limits and limits on battleships for the major powers. But the major accomplishment was the Nine-Power Treaty, recognizing the territorial integrity of China and the open door. The other participants induced Japan to accept these provisions by accepting its special position in Manchuria. They went along with it because they could maintain their presence in Manchukuo, as it will become called. During the remainder of the 1920s, Japan attempted to play by the rules laid down at the Washington Conference. Known as Shirihara diplomacy, after the foreign minister and later prime minister who attempted to carry it out, this policy sought to achieve Japanese interest in Asia through diplomacy and economic means. But this approach came under severe pressure as Japanese industrialists began to move into new areas such as chemicals, mining, and the manufacturing of appliances and automobiles. Because such industries needed resources not found in abundance locally, the Japanese government came under increasing pressure to find new sources abroad. And this led to the rise of militant nationalism. In the early 1930s, with the onset of the Great Depression and growing tensions in the international arena, nationalist forces rose to dominance in the Japanese government. And the military officers and the ultra-nationalist politicians who dominated the government in the 1930s were convinced that the diplomacy of the 1920s had failed and they advocated a more aggressive approach to protecting national interests in a brutal and competitive world. That ends part 4.